In this podcast episode, Chris and Joe Hudson delve into the intricacies of emotional well being, personal transformation, and navigating life with an open heart. They discuss the challenges of healing deep seated patterns, managing emotions like anger and fear, shifting from victimhood to agency, the complexities of boundaries, and the importance of vulnerability and congruence. The conversation also touches on practical aspects of decision making, relationship dynamics, overcoming overwhelm, and maintaining authenticity in a world that often resists change. Throughout, Joe shares insights from his retreats, personal experiences, and work with clients, offering listeners a profound exploration of how to break free from cycles of helplessness and step into a more empowered and connected way of living. Joe opens by acknowledging the difficulty yet necessity of living with an open heart. While it seems natural and beneficial, the experience can feel intensely vulnerable and unfamiliar. Years of conditioning and fear cause many to close their hearts, believing it protects them from harm. But the truth is that closing off only leads to pain. Drawing from examples like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., Joe highlights that being open-hearted does not inherently lead to being taken advantage of. Instead, an open heart is a source of true strength and healing. The psychological resistance to love often comes from past wounds where love was entangled with guilt, criticism, or obligation, producing a fearful association that makes love seem unsafe. This fear manifests in patterns such as jealousy or self-criticism, which hinder genuine connection with others and oneself. Joe describes how his intensive retreats provide a powerful container where participants experience transparency and emotional safety akin to a patting hand rather than a harmful one. This controlled environment allows them to depattern old reactions and begin opening their hearts in ways that feel alien but healing. However, returning to the real world, full of unpredictable and often cold interactions, presents a new set of challenges. Participants often report feeling disoriented or overwhelmed in everyday spaces, such as grocery stores or massage parlors, because their previous defensive patterns no longer serve them, and new ways of interacting have yet to take root. Joe likens this to shaking a sketch. The familiar lines of one's identity are blurred, requiring relearning how to engage authentically with the world. Joe explains how individuals maintain negative emotional patterns through three mechanisms: attracting the same experiences or people who reinforce the pain, manipulating others unconsciously to elicit critical responses or rejection, and mapping, or interpreting neutral events as confirming their painful beliefs. Recognizing these patterns is vital in moving beyond them. When participants are freed from these cycles during the retreat, they confront the challenge of relearning interaction patterns in daily life without falling back into old behaviors. The conversation explores the paradoxical role of heartbreak and pain. Joe contends that heartbreak should not be feared but embraced, as it expands one's capacity for love and connection. Pain avoided becomes a form of suffering that festers, whereas pain faced allows healing. This principle echoes through parenting, where Joe likens the experience to a deep tissue massage that breaks down rigid identities, enabling discovery of one's true self beyond old defenses. Going into the pain intentionally aligns with psychological studies showing that confronting depression authentically reduces recurrence and cultivates resilience. Joe outlines the difference between avoiding depression by dissociation or distraction and leaning into it through curiosity and self-compassion. Depression often represents suppressed anger, sadness, and disconnection. By gently exploring these emotions and reparenting oneself, individuals can dismantle the judgment against their suffering and find healing. The key is making oneself safe to be as they are, shifting the narrative from "I am broken" to "I am lovable as I am." Fear frequently paralyzes people from confronting their true feelings or expressing vulnerability. Joe reassures that fear is natural and that holding space for it with kindness is part of the healing journey. He shares stories highlighting the power of simple acceptance, like the man who washed the feet of his depressed friend weekly, embodying unconditional support that opposed the negative self-judgment the friend was experiencing. This kind of relational safety is fundamental in dissolving shame and fostering self-love. Joe discusses how jealousy and self-judgment mirror the internal conflict about love and acceptance. These emotions often push people into destructive behaviors out of fear of not being enough or losing love. Recognizing these feelings as signs of unmet needs rather than threats allows one to choose vulnerability over defensiveness. This insight extends to self-love, where acceptance fights the same urge to critique and reject. Joe challenges common misconceptions about boundaries, differentiating genuine boundaries from power struggles. A boundary is about owning one's actions and responses rather than controlling others. Good boundaries protect one's capacity to love without oppressing or attacking. He shares his evolving boundaries with his father, illustrating how boundaries can soften and adapt as one gains self-authority and security. The fear of losing connection often underlies inconsistent boundary enforcement, but consistent, compassionate boundaries tend to deepen mutual respect and connection over time. Joe reframes anger from a problematic outburst to a fluid energy signaling the need for action and defense of self. Anger becomes healthy when acknowledged and directed wisely, rather than suppressed or turned into aggression. He notes that many people convert anger into socially acceptable sadness because anger risks rejection. Understanding the function of anger as communication about violated boundaries allows individuals to harness it constructively. Shame is identified as the foundational block behind avoidance and silent suffering. Joe highlights that all unresolved shame is essentially unloved parts of oneself, and that vulnerability is the antidote. Sharing shame with trusted others creates decomposition of its toxicity and transforms it into healing. Avoiding this process keeps shame buried and perpetuates dysfunction in relationships and self-image. Rumination and overthinking signal unexpressed or avoided emotions. Joe emphasizes expressing emotions internally without projecting them onto others as a way to interrupt these harmful loops. When feelings are fully felt, clarity about what actions are required quickly arises. Thus, emotional expression is the key to decision-making, freeing the mind from obsessive cycles. Decisions are fundamentally motivated by desires to feel certain ways or avoid discomfort. Joe explains that recognizing the emotional basis of choices clarifies the decision-making process. When people learn to love their feelings rather than resist them, their choices become more authentic and effortless. Success is often linked with a willingness to accept disagreement and emotional consequence derived from having an open heart. Joe and Chris discuss the social risk involved in embracing emotional sensitivity and openness, especially in environments that value toughness or stoicism. They highlight the importance of vagal authority or maintaining calm nervous system control as a means of commanding respect and diffusing judgment. They use the metaphor of the ocean's power over the sword to illustrate how unreactive presence disarms aggression. Embracing sensitivity is a courageous act in a culture that often mocks vulnerability. Transformation frequently destabilizes relationships because others hold on to outdated images or expectations. Joe references object relations theory to explain how people interact with internalized, simplified versions of others rather than their full complexity. Conscious communication, sharing one's evolving context and intentions, can soften resistance among friends and colleagues, creating supportive spaces for growth. Joe emphasizes the importance of transparency and storytelling in maintaining connection through change. Joe and Chris talk about the transition from living inauthentically or from unintegrated patterns to a place of authentic congruence where heart, mind, and action align. This process often involves a valley of despair, a period marked by uncertainty, loss of former results, and self-doubt. Although intense and disorienting, this stage is necessary for deeper growth. They argue that prior successes may have been limited or unfulfilling, fueling the drive toward more authentic ways of being. Understanding the difference between being swept away by instinctual emotion and listening to cultivated intuition is crucial. While impulsive emotional reactions often perpetuate pain, intuition brings calm, flow, and right timing. Joe encourages acting quickly on realizations to accelerate transformation, noting that repeated practice of aligned actions deepens intuitive competence and expands freedom. Both hosts reflect on the isolating phase when a person has outgrown their current social circle but has yet to establish new relationships that support their evolving self. This lonely chapter is marked by self-doubt and social friction, as others unconsciously resist the person's change and seek to nudge them back into the familiar role. Conscious awareness of this dynamic helps to persevere through this stage. Joe critiques modern notions of efficiency equated with speed rather than energy economy. He stresses that efficiency without awareness contributes to burnout. Overwhelm generally signals unprocessed emotions and neglected important tasks rather than mere busyness. Highly effective people embrace chaos in less critical areas to focus intensely on a few key priorities, a skill that requires discernment and acceptance. Joe distinguishes between motivation fueled by wants, authentic desires that energize, and shoulds, which are often driven by shame or obligation and tend to fail as sustainable motivators. Unlocking the underlying wants behind shoulds creates choice and opens pathways to enjoyable, self-directed action. Experimenting with different ways to satisfy wants rather than enforcing narrow should rules fosters lasting change. Joe illustrates how much conflict stems from people feeling unseen, attempting to change each other, or defending themselves emotionally. Manifestations of a shame-hot potato dynamic where blame and defensiveness circulate endlessly. Breaking this cycle requires affirming each other's feelings, expressing needs without judgment, and ceasing attempts to control. Being seen and accepted dissolves shame and blueprints love. Trying to change others or oneself via willpower or shame inevitably backfires. All attempts to coerce change communicate a lack of love and acceptance, which breeds resistance. True change arises naturally from authentic wants and self-love, not from rattling shoulds or external pressure. Joe uses personal anecdotes to demonstrate how struggles to modify a partner's traits often mirror one's own internal struggles. Joe notes that people often encounter ridicule or misunderstanding when embracing emotional openness. He advises seeing others' judgments as reflections of their own inner conflicts rather than truths about oneself. Maintaining self-compassion and calm presence, vagal authority, helps weather external resistance without sealing one's heart shut again. Effective communication involves sharing not just decisions, but the context and motivations behind them. This transparency builds trust, aids alignment, and prevents misunderstanding or conflict. Joe notes that CEOs and partners alike benefit from making their perspectives and vulnerabilities known to foster collaboration and shared responsibility. Reflecting on lessons from elite athletes and creators, Joe stresses that sustained success arises from loving the practice and engagement itself, not chasing fleeting rewards like fame or recognition. Fully inhabiting the experience of desire without attachment to outcomes opens freedom and deepens fulfillment. Joe encourages exploring multiple ways to satisfy a desire rather than perceiving change as a rigid, obligatory should. For example, to feel healthy, one might try pickleball, dancing, hiking, or social connection, creating diversity and increased motivation. This approach makes transformation more accessible and joyful. Decisions are easier and more aligned when the emotional subsystem is fully allowed expression rather than suppressed. Acceptance of feelings, fear, excitement, vulnerability enables more authentic choices. Joe highlights that successful people are often those comfortable with emotional consequences, including disagreement or disappointment. Joe reflects on the universality of human experience, reminding listeners that beneath public identities, titles, or social status, everyone experiences emotions like sadness, anger, and longing. Recognizing this shared humanity softens illusions of separateness and fosters empathy and humility. Joe emphasizes that personal transformation requires reclaiming one's own authority rather than outsourcing it to external figures or idols. Skepticism toward anyone claiming total authority or guru status protects against dependency and empowers sustainable growth rooted in self-knowledge. Toward the podcast's close, Joe shares his evolving approach to content creation, embracing formats like critiques and reactions that align with his values and bring joy. Choosing projects congruent with one's authentic interests sustains motivation and impact, even as one balances exposure fears and public expectations. Throughout, Joe and Chris remind listeners that no matter one's achievements or struggles, the core of life is connection, being seen, being loved without conditions, and loving oneself. This recognition offers the deepest source of freedom from the loops of helplessness and shame.